Hey, Marcy. Marcy. Please come here. Hey, good morning. Thanks for being here. Ready whenever you are, sir. Okay. Well, thanks to everyone for being here today to discuss how the United States and our allies can transfer billions of dollars of frozen Russian sovereign assets to help in the effort in the war in Ukraine. It's very timely. I just got back from the White House in a situation room talking about an emergency national security aid supplemental package that would include Israel funding, which is desperately needed, Ukraine. It would also include Indo-Pacific and the border. These are dangerous times. I don't need to tell anybody in this room that fact when Hamas invaded Israel last week. Between the Hamas-Israel war, the growing threat of the CCP around the world, particularly the Pacific and the South China Sea, we can't lose our focus on Ukraine, the largest invasion in Europe since World War II. I've been critical of the Biden administration for being weak, leading from behind, slow, rolling the weapons necessary for Ukraine to win. I've been pushing for the attack-ins. We met with Zelensky just 2 weeks ago, and I said, what do you need? He said, I need the long-range artillery. I can't hit the Iranian drones in Crimea without the longer-range artillery. I don't know why that decision is so difficult. And, you know, you have the NSC blaming the DOD blaming others. Fact is, they can win this thing if we gave them what they needed. And I agree with Colin Powell. You either go all in or you get out. And we ought to be going all in for victory. And I know on my side of the aisle, they want a path to victory, an administration that can win. We don't like losing. The American people don't like losing. We like to win. And we can't hold the political will of the American people if we have a failing program and a mismanaged war. And they don't want to bear the burden of this cost as Europe is not living up to its commitment. Now, some NATO countries are, and they are stepping up to the plate, but there are still others that are not. This administration's commitment to supporting Ukraine is, quote, for as long as it takes. My response immediately was it shouldn't take that long. And that's not a strategy. We want victory as soon as possible. We need to know that the burden is going to be shared. And not only must Europe continue to provide Ukraine more non-security assistance than the United States provides, but also the Russian sovereign assets is a winner, in my judgment. If we can tap into the very people who started this war and this conflict, in my judgment, should be paying for the cost and not as much the U.S. taxpayer. And that's why I introduced the REPO Act, the bipartisan, bicameral legislation that demands that the Biden administration transfer frozen Russian sovereign assets to the Ukraine effort. It's beyond time that Russia pay for the war that it created. My bill prohibits the Biden administration from unfreezing Russian sovereign assets until Russia ends its unprovoked war of aggression and agrees to compensate Ukraine for the damages it has inflicted. The administration's disastrous $6 billion payment for Iran as part of a hostage deal with the Ayatollah exposed their willingness, I should say, to trade away billions of dollars in negotiations with our adversaries. And that's why I introduced a bill this month to permanently freeze the $6 billion of Iranian funds covered under the hostage deal through secondary sanctions. We must ensure These funds remain out of the hands of Iran and out of the hands of terrorist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. We cannot allow Biden to greenlight the return of Russian sovereign assets to Putin and the Russian war machine. To be clear, the war crimes and genocide committed by Russia cannot be reversed by money alone. Murdered innocent civilians included women and children. They can't be brought back, and the trauma of the war will never be forgotten. But critical infrastructure, homes, towns, and businesses can be rebuilt. I hope we get to a reconstruction phase. I hope this conflict can be resolved. And along with our European and G7 allies, we hold as much as $300 billion of Russian funds that can be used for not only Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction, but also immediate economic and humanitarian assistance. Importantly, taking this action would be a deterrence to other would-be aggressors with a clear message. The financial systems of the G7 and EU will be closed off to those who violate another nation's sovereignty. Chairman Xi needs to see the free world has the will and the fortitude to ensure bullies cannot act with impunity. Transferring Russian sovereign assets is not just the morally right thing to do, it's strategically the right thing to do. It's also the fiscally responsible thing to do on behalf of our constituents. Putin caused this devastation, and in my judgment, Putin must pay for it. That's what this bill is all about. I want to thank the members for being here on this very important topic. As if we ever get a speaker back in the chair, this is going to be one of the first items on the agenda in our national security interest to defend Israel, to defend Ukraine from aggression, to defend our borders, and to defend Taiwan. And with that, I'd like to recognize the ranking member pro tem, I should say, Ms. Marcy Kaptur.
Thank you, Chair McCall, and I know Ranking Member Meeks is on his way. Thank you very much for hosting this urgent roundtable hearing and for welcoming me to join your distinguished members and participate in today's meeting as a guest non-member of this committee. I also want to thank our witnesses, Ms. Heinrichs and Mr. Zelikow, for being with us today. You have such extraordinary histories and contributions to our world and to our nation for caring about this critical issue. As co-chair of the Congressional Ukraine Caucus and an original co-sponsor of the REPO Act, I appreciate the significant work that the House Foreign Affairs Committee has done and is continuing to do to ensure America stands with our Ukrainian partners in liberty's cause, as Ukraine is suffering through one of the darkest periods in its history. Only together will we prevail against Putin's evil, unprovoked aggression across Ukraine's sovereign borders. We must be clear, responsibility for this senseless and brutal war being waged against Ukraine lies with Vladimir Putin alone and his corrupted Russian state apparatus. Therefore, it must be Russia that shoulders responsibility for rebuilding Ukraine in the aftermath. The spirit and determination of the Ukrainian people remains unbroken. However, the dams, hospitals, schools, courts of law, farmlands, universities, neighborhoods, which have been decimated by Russian tanks, mines, bombs, drones, will require time and significant resources to emerge from the ashes. The Biden administration, with the strong bipartisan support of Congress and this committee, has taken many steps to hold those who are accountable for this destructive conflict financially accountable for their crimes. These actions have included unprecedented sanctions against the Russian state, targeted sanctions against the most powerful individuals who are enabling Putin's war, and the freezing of Russian individuals and state financial assets in the United States. Through American leadership, we have successfully, and I might say bipartisan, we have successfully rallied our allies across Europe to take similar actions, but more must be done, and that's why we're here today. It's time to ensure the administration has the undisputed authority to seize the frozen Russian state assets so that they can be repurposed for Ukraine, and that there is an international framework through which we can work with our allies to achieve this goal together. I was proud to work with Chair McCall and thank him for his leadership, and fellow original co-sponsors in the House, as well as Senators Risch and Whitehouse, to introduce the Rebuilding Economic Prosperity and Opportunity for Ukraine Act, REPO, which will ensure Russia bears the cost of returning Ukraine to her full glory while guaranteeing that the Ukrainian people can truly prosper in their hard-fought struggle for liberty. However, I understand that there are some parties out there who have concerns about taking this approach, especially on the part of the banks and financial institutions who currently hold Russia's foreign assets. And that is why I'm eager to join this discussion today so as this body seeks to act on the issue of seizing Russian state assets for the purpose of rebuilding Ukraine, we do so in a way that takes those concerns into account. We must take every action available to us to ensure Ukraine achieves full victory. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today and continuing to work with Chair McCall and Ranking Member Meeks and all of your members on this urgent priority. And I thank you for the opportunity to participate and testify. I yield back.
Thank you, Marcia. I appreciate your steadfast support for this cause. At the end of the day, we know we're on the right side of history. When we look back, we know we're on the right side of history. I'd now like to recognize Mr. Representative French Hill for any opening remarks he may have.
Thank you, Chairman, and I appreciate the roundtable being before us. It's good to see Mr. Tellico again. I want to thank the Chairman for his steadfast, consistent, and firm leadership on this topic. And I'm glad we're going to discuss the topic of reconstruction and using Russian sovereign assets. I, too, have introduced a bill on this topic, H.R. 5370, and I appreciate the Foreign Affairs staff working with me on that. My bill would give the President authority to seize and transfer title of Russian sovereign assets within the United States jurisdiction into an international fund for the sole purpose of Ukraine's eventual reconstruction and humanitarian relief. I want to be grateful. I'm grateful to Chairman McCall, and I co-sponsor his bill on this topic as well for his leadership. Although our bills take different approaches, there's bipartisan recognition in the Congress that the United States must play a leadership role globally by coordinating with the G7 countries and our other allies to make Russia pay full damages for the atrocities and war crimes against Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. The goal was the same. Russia should be responsible for the cost of damages stemming from its illegal invasion of Ukraine, not American taxpayers. My approach was crafted to be consistent with U.S. policy and international law by amending the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA, and using its established framework and existing definitions. As a former Treasury official, in my view, this is a better legislative approach. This is consistent with well-established international precedent, whereby the United States worked with international partners to establish a fund like we saw in Afghanistan in 2022, the Iran-U.S. Claims Tribunal in 1981, the UN Compensation Fund for Kuwait in 1991, following the invasion by Iraq. Considering most Russian sovereign assets are actually located outside the United States, it's important for our partners and allies around the world to introduce and pass similar companion legislation rather than having the U.S. act unilaterally. I had a visit last week with the rapporteur for the Council of Europe, Lisem Basha, about this and their views in Europe. And further, let me be clear, I consider Russian Federation sovereign assets inclusive of all state-owned enterprise assets and those of Russian publicly traded companies like Gazprom that are controlled by more than 50% by the Russian Federation. Unfortunately, Mr. Chairman, I've got to step out into a meeting at the Intel Committee on Gaza, but I look forward to the discussion today, hearing questions from members and comments from our witnesses. I welcome each of you to review my legislation and extend an invitation to meet with my staff and discuss how my legislation can complement the excellent work by our Chairman McCall, and his bill on a bicameral and bipartisan basis. I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
And I thank the gentleman. I look forward to working with you. This will be our next markup. Next week will be on Iran, but the following markup, we will mark up this bill, and I look forward to working with you on the provisions in your bill. It's my great pleasure to welcome Philip Zelikoff, who's a senior fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution and is a White Burkett Miller Professor of History at the University of Virginia. He has a renowned career in public service. I commend him for his recent contributions to the public debate over Russian state assets, including his assistance in drafting the Repo Act. With that, I now recognize you, sir, for your remarks.
Thank you, Chairman, for your leadership. Thank you also, Congresswoman Kaptur, for your bipartisan support for this legislation, and Congressman Hill's role has been very important too from the start. Since the moral and political case for Russia paying for its aggression is, I think, reasonably clear, I'm not going to waste time with a lot of rhetoric on that. I'm going to make 3 points. Point 1, economic warfare is the real center of gravity in this war. Economic warfare is the center of gravity in the war. I know we all watch the daily updates from the battlefront lines. You know, this movement here, that movement there. This is a war of attrition. It's going to be decided by economic and industrial staying power as the war continues almost certainly into 2025 and perhaps beyond. In that struggle, the economic warfare against Russia has achieved some gains and will have some more gains over the long haul. Russia's economic warfare against Ukraine has been devastating and is not sufficiently appreciated. Ukraine lost 30% of its GDP in the first year of the war. 1/3 of the population of Ukraine is displaced, half externally, half internally. Russia is waging economic warfare on 3 main fronts. It's destroying Ukraine's infrastructure and will do another energy infrastructure war this winter, for which it's gearing up, including with North Korean weapons and Iranian weapons. Point 2, they've destroyed Ukraine's ability to export through the Black Sea, except for a trickle, which was the fundamental business model of a commodity exporting country. Point 3, they have destroyed Ukraine's civil aviation. Ukraine has no civil aviation. Any of you who have traveled, as I have, to Ukraine will notice that you can't fly in the country, which makes travel and business in the country now back to the era of the railroads before there were airplanes. So the Russian economic warfare against Ukraine is devastating, and as time passes, this is going to have deep effects on the ability of Ukraine's economy and society to hold together, which will play out politically. So point 1, economic warfare is the true center of gravity in the war. 2, the Russian assets are the key strategy to change the outcome. The Russian assets are key. The Russian assets are at least $280 billion. $280 billion. Now, even in our debased day and age, that's a lot of money. It's a lot of money in the context of the Ukrainian economy. Even using very conservative multipliers of how much private investment the public investment can unlock, let's say 1-to-1, the impact of this money on the whole future prospects of Ukraine and its staying power are decisive. Otherwise, they're relying on US and European taxpayers whose readiness you can gauge. So this is potentially the decisive fulcrum of the economic warfare and Ukraine's prospects in the war. So, 3rd point, why has this been so hard? First reason was there was a knee-jerk neuralgia on the part of bankers and financiers to the actual confiscation of Russian assets in the foreign exchange holdings, with much talk of losing confidence in the dollar and the euro. On analysis, these worries quickly fall away, which is one reason that I worked with my colleagues Larry Summers, the former Treasury Secretary, and Bob Zoellick, the former president of the World Bank, who do know something about international finance, to debunk those concerns. And I'd be glad to go into more detail about why the concerns about the dollar or the euro turn out to be overblown when they're analyzed. But the other concern was that how do we do this legally? And there's been a ton of legal confusion about this. This bill will help dispel that legal confusion. On some very important legal work that's been done on the American domestic legal authorities, I think will also have now kind of cleared the air on this point. Then there is discussions about things, well, what about sovereign immunity? But sovereign immunity is a doctrine that only exists in the context of national courts trying to usurp sovereign authority. In a situation where it's sovereign on sovereign, whereas in this bill there would be an act of state, that goes after Russian sovereign property. There is no such thing as immunity. There is no doctrine of sovereign immunity. Ordinarily, under international law, if one sovereign takes another sovereign's property, then the loser is entitled to compensation for that nationalization or expropriation. So why isn't Russia entitled for that compensation in this case? Because it's a lawful state countermeasure. Countermeasures are different from sanctions. And countermeasures, and this is a well-recognized body of law, you are allowed to do things that would ordinarily violate your sovereign obligations to a fellow sovereign because that sovereign has committed such extreme outlaw behavior that the countermeasure is a lawful recourse. And that is exactly the extreme case we have here. There's a well-codified body of law on this, and Russia has hit every one of the marks for a set of lawful state countermeasures that deprives them of any right to compensation when states take their money and then use it, putting it in escrow to compensate the victims of Russia's aggression. So it's the center of gravity in the war. It's the key point in the strategy that changes the whole prospect. And the financial and legal concerns have been worked through and can be addressed. And this committee's bill, I think, will make a real contribution to achieving that goal.
Thank you, Mr. Zelikoff. I'm pleased to now welcome Rebecca Heinrichs, Senior Fellow and Director at the Keystone Defense Initiative at the Hudson Institute. She's an expert on U.S. foreign and defense policy, especially when it comes to Putin's Russia, and I applaud her advocacy for the need to hold Russia accountable and push for measures to hasten Ukraine's victory. I now recognize you for your testimony.
Thank you so much, Chairman McCall, Ranking Member Meeks, distinguished members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm going to stick with why I think that this is smart policy, why I think that this is key to actually convincing Russia that it should look towards an end of this conflict, and why it sends a signal to other would-be aggressors that the United States is willing to exercise these tools beyond simply military solutions. First, I will say I'm not going to discuss some of the legal issues. We'll turn that over to the other panelists. But I do want to make the point that I think that this is really important on the international law argument that Canada, notoriously a strong proponent of following international law, has led the way in pursuing this exact option. There has been something like a Canadian repo. Finance Minister Freeland said, quote, "We think it's really important to extend our legal authorities because it's going to be really important to find the money to rebuild Ukraine. I can think of no more appropriate source of that funding than confiscated Russian assets." She went on later to say, "Canada will not be a haven for their ill-gotten gains. It is just inappropriate for Russian assets to be used to help rebuild Ukraine," end quote. Canada's clarity is significant and commendable, and I think worth following. Russia's unprovoked, unlawful, large-scale invasion of Ukraine is in its 20th month. It is the largest ground war in Europe since the Second World War, following the inception of the U.S.-led order that we established with our allies, based on the principles of rule of law, peaceful resolution of conflict, respect for territorial sovereignty and integrity. This was a war of Russia's choosing. It was not provoked. It chose this war. It has come at enormous cost to the Ukrainian people. Ukraine's Office of the Prosecutor General has recorded over 100,000 potential war crimes committed by Russian forces. Russia has engaged in mass abduction of children. Tens of thousands of Ukrainian children have been kidnapped and relocated to Russia by the invaders. There's evidence of Russian forces shooting civilians very intentionally. The invading forces went on a murderous rampage in Bucha, killing more than 400 civilians. This is a war on Ukrainian society, not just the Ukrainian military. Initially, the Kremlin sought to break apart the NATO alliance, weaken it, and divide NATO. It failed, and instead, NATO welcomed new member Finland in April and will soon welcome Sweden as the alliance's 32nd member. Though Putin was unable to immediately divide the alliance, Russia now believes it can outlast democratic capitals. Seeing the high price tags not only for the war effort, but Ukraine's economy and society. Putin hopes democratic countries tire of arming Ukraine and to force Kyiv to concede territory to Russia to end the war. So for U.S. interests in European security, it would be a mistake for democratic countries to begin showing that we are flagging in support. Ukraine has succeeded in retaking significant territory and has degraded Russia's conventional military. According to credible public reporting, Ukraine has destroyed more than 1,500 tanks, more than 600 armored fighting vehicles, more than almost 2,000 infantry fighting vehicles, 216 multiple rocket launchers. I could go on. Most recent reporting in the last 48 hours is that using American-made weapon systems, ATACMS, which the chairman mentioned that this body has been pressing the administration to release to Ukraine from the beginning of the war, that Ukraine was able to successfully use those to attack and destroy 9 Russian military helicopters, an air defense system, an ammunition depot at 2 airfields in occupied territory. I would also just want to foot stomp something that the chairman said about the IRGC operating in Crimea and training Russia on their drones. And so as the Congress does consider providing necessary aid to Israel in its war against Iranian-backed Hamas in Gaza, to understand that to go after the Iranian war machine, you can do that by destroying Hamas and also by equipping Ukraine to go after those IRGC soldiers who are aiding the Russian forces in attacking Ukraine. So Ukraine does continue to make significant military gains in defense of its country and to restore its territory. And the United States directly benefits from Ukraine's battlefield successes as Russia remains a top-tier adversary of the United States. These are the weapons that Americans made and designed specifically to go after the kinds of things that the Ukrainians are destroying in the Russian military. But Putin believes Russia will only need to absorb this high cost until the West grows weary. In conclusion, I'm just going to wrap up 2 things in this repo bill that I think are very significant and worth supporting. One is the point that we've already discussed, empowering and authorizing the Secretary of State to access these frozen funds to pay for the Ukrainian society. That is something that will have a deterrent effect to other would-be aggressors, China in particular, which many people have suggested that because of the United States' economic interdependency with the Chinese economy, that it would be very difficult to deter the Chinese. I think this sends a very significant signal that the United States will exercise all tools, including economic, to inflict a high cost if China were to do something like, for instance, invade Taiwan. But the other piece of this, which I think is really important, is the provision that Section 103, the prohibition on the release of blocked Russian sovereign assets. Russia should not be permitted to have access to these funds until these following criteria are met. At no point should Russia enjoy the use of these funds again while Ukraine is left with rebuilding its society. The fundamental question is, at the end of this war, who is going to pay for Ukrainian society to be rebuilt? It should not be the American people primarily. It should not be European capitals. It should be the perpetrators of the crime. That's the Russian Federation. And with that, Chairman, I'll end my remarks.
Thank you so much, both of you, for your remarks. And yeah, I think this really boils down to fairness and justice. My good friend, Mr. Meeks, was a state prosecutor. I was a federal prosecutor. We know what that means. And who should be paying for this? The perpetrator, not the victims. And I want to ask you a couple of questions. The EU has a plan just to tax frozen assets and send those proceeds to Ukraine. Our Treasury Secretary, Ms. Yellen, recently claimed that transferring sovereign assets to Ukraine was not legal. Do you agree with that? And if not, what is your opinion from a legal standpoint?
I think Secretary Yellen has now revised her view of this matter, having had a chance to be informed by some of the legal work that's been done since she first made that impromptu remark. Mm-hmm. There is the legal authority both under domestic law and international law, and the bill this committee is considering would both reaffirm and consolidate and elaborate that authority. So legally, this can be done. On the issue, though, of the EU's measures, what the EU came up with in May was the idea, they were encountering a lot of resistance to actually taking the Russian money. So they said, well, can we come up with something, since a lot of these securities have now matured and are in cash, and Euroclear, mainly, the clearinghouse in Brussels, is now managing the cash on behalf of Russia can't manage it because Russia is no longer able to manage it. So can we do something with the interest? And that, by the way, the EU couldn't get that through in June. Ursula von der Leyen couldn't get that adopted over principally French and German opposition at the time. So they're talking about just taking this interest. As a legal matter, if you have the legal right to take the interest, you have the legal right to take the principal. This was a cosmetic idea trying to overcome the opposition they had there. It's kind of a situation where, as one of my colleagues in this effort, Larry Tribe, has put it, is, well, instead of crossing the Rubicon, they're kind of wading in. From a legal point of view, it's actually clearer to do the transfer for Ukraine than to try to expropriate the money using tax authorities, which makes it look like you're expropriating it for your country rather than for the benefit of the victims, which is a much cleaner legal way to do it. They ended up, for political reasons, with a half measure that takes only a tiny fraction of what they should and does so in ways that are actually legally awkward. I understand why they are where they are, but as they process this, I think they're just going to have to step up to going ahead and crossing the Rubicon.
Ms. Heinrich, you mentioned the impact this would have on other foreign adversaries, and you also talked about Iran's role in this with their drones in Crimea. We also know Mr. Putin just met with Hamas not too long before the invasion of Israel. This alliance is very clear. It's Russia, China, and the Ayatollah. What impact do you believe, if this body passed this bill and it was signed into law, what impact would this have on our adversaries like Chairman Xi and his desire to reunify, in his words, Taiwan, and what impact would this have on Iran?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. I would just also note that Putin will be meeting with Xi again as well. So the two of them have continued to deepen their cooperation and increasingly are looking for ways to deepen their military cooperation in particular. So you were right to make the connection between China, Russia, and Iran, and looking for opportunities for them to undermine U.S. interests and the interest of our allies. I think that as we move into this very perilous time where we're going to have two major nuclear powers contending with the United States for preeminence to supplant the United States, that we will have to look at all tools of American power, and that goes beyond the military solution, so we must look at economic solutions. So I think this sends a strong signal and further complicates the calculations of Xi Jinping that there will be economic price to pay, that the United States is willing to do that, and this certainly sends a signal that we would.
Thank you. And just to close, you mentioned war of attrition, and that's been my worst nightmare because this is exactly what Putin wants. He wants to drag this out and thinking that the will of the American people and the Europeans will fade, and I hope that doesn't happen because there's too much at stake in this conflict. So with that, I recognize the ranking member, Mr. Meigs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony. I apologize for being a little bit late. So I'd like to, before I get to questions, if I have time, just to give some of my thoughts on what has taken place and where we headed. I know prior to Russia's full-scale brutal invasion in Ukraine in February of 2022, the Biden administration and our partners were aggressively coordinating robust and unprecedented economic actions against Putin's Russia. Within hours of the invasion, the U.S. and our allies announced a package of sanctions against Russian banks, then imposed export controls, followed by targeted personal sanctions. And then only 2 days later, the United States the EU and the UK and Canada prohibited any business with the Russian central bank, a colossal move motivated by diplomacy, of which I believe in, and collective determination to curb Russia's heinous war. Russia, we now know, they didn't expect this kind of reaction to the invasion, and they counted on lighter measures happening to them, along with counting on disunity of our friends and our allies. And as a matter of policy, these economic tools are only one set of actions in a war, and the effects are often felt on a different time frame than on the battlefield. Sanctions can take time to sink in and fundamentally change behaviors. These tools are also best when used in coordination with other advanced economies, not by ourselves, making evasion more difficult or impossible. Nevertheless, as the war evolves, so should our economic strategy. I think we should not only be thinking of multilateral ways to hamper or undercut Russia's war efforts, but should also be focusing on ways to help Ukraine and enable it to emerge a stable economic player in Europe. This must be something allies plan for, we need to plan for now, not only after Ukraine wins the war. So in that vein, I was pleased to meet with Special Representative for Ukraine's economic recovery, Penny Pritzker, in her role in leveraging the private sector, working with the G7, and identifying Ukraine's strategic economic needs will be essential to it in winning the peace. One of the tools we have yet to exercise deals with the future of Russian sovereign assets. It is an attractive solution for many on the economic issues facing Ukraine. For now, there are encouraging signs from allies in Europe where most of these assets sit. I expect more progress should happen on this soon, perhaps as part of this week's EU-US summit. I constantly argue that we should act in coordination with our democratic allies in our support for Ukraine. That unity is the key. Putin knows that. If we're not unified, Putin then has an opportunity to win. That unity comes first. So our freezing of Russian assets has also given us leverage, perhaps not to use now, but within the future, with a future Russia, something Ukrainian victory will help bring about. Crucially, the decision to transfer this significant sum of money deserves appropriate consideration of the potential unintended consequences of such a policy. There's no doubt that Russia needs to pay for what it has unleashed on Ukraine's infrastructure, its economy, and its society. The U.S., along with our partners, are committed to bringing Ukraine's economy off the life support that it needs to survive the war and emerge stronger. That's the objective, to emerge stronger than before the invasion. In that process, we should consider the transfer of frozen state assets of the aggressor state. So I just wanted to emphasize so much what this unity and what the policy was, because that is something that Putin very definitely did not account for. So I only have 18 seconds, but you know, this economic statecraft is also, you know, really important to me. And you don't have to, because one of the things I always worried about or thought about is how does the economic statecraft fit into a wider security strategy of defense, deterrence, and support for Ukraine, and how should we consider measuring that effectiveness?
Representative Meeks, that's actually a great way to approach the problem, because the whole argument that I made in an article with Summers and Zellick in Foreign Affairs is that actually this is a strategy for victory. You put this enormous war chest and the multiplier of private investment into play. And what you can envision is a whole new European recovery program anchored on the rebuilding of Ukraine that not only saves Ukraine, revitalizes it, but links it to the EU accession process, to the enlargement of the European Union, and in other words, to the victory of the whole cause of freedom, in a way almost regardless of where the final battle line ends up being in Ukraine. Ukraine will be growing with bright prospects, part of a Europe with brighter prospects because of its alignment with the free world. That's the kind of strategy that these resources can anchor. And that's why this vision, this positive vision, is so important to articulate. The other thing I just stress, sir, because you emphasized the working with allies in this economic context, is when people worry about the significance of this in foreign exchange, I ask them to just remember two numbers, 93 and 3. 93 and 3. If you look at the percentage of foreign exchange holdings held in the world today, 60% United States, 23% euro, 6 yen, 4 sterling. That's 93. Percentage of foreign exchange holdings in Chinese renminbi, 3. And the Chinese are really encouraged that it's gone up from 2.5 to 3 in recent years. So when you look at 93 to 3, that's what you get when we work with our allies in a concerted economic strategy. We can move on the Russian assets, and there's really no choice except to stick with the currencies of the free world because they're still the only basis for being a participant in the world economy.
Very briefly, yeah.
Sure. Congressman, if I just might, I'd say it's also very important, though, to keep in mind that it is critical that Ukraine win on the battlefield. And so, you know, although I appreciate your remarks that this administration has committed to Ukraine's defense, it has been quite slow in providing a lot of these arms. It also has left quite a few of economic sanctions on the table, and this is another example that the administration so far has been unwilling to go this route. Time and again, it's been Congress that has pressured the administration to go more, to push more, to not be so afraid of escalation or Russian retaliation because we need Ukraine to prevail. And so I just want to make the point that this is another example of Congress coming along and pushing the administration to provide that economic backstop, even as you pressure the administration to continue to provide the arms that Ukraine needs to win on the battlefield.
Thank you. I agree, agree with that assessment. We have a vote on the floor at 11 o'clock, so I'm going to limit each member to 3 minutes so we can hopefully get to as many as we can. Mr. Huizinga.
Well, thank you, and I was actually going to give some of my time for you to explain a little more and unpack that about the fungibility. Basically, that's your point, correct? Is how do we utilize this? One quick question. This is kind of a specific, and this might be more to the chairman. Is the sole discretion of this, and maybe you can speak to what's happening both in Europe and in Canada. Is this at the discretion of the Secretary of State as to where and how this would be released? Sorry, Mr. Chairman, and we can have this conversation offline. I'm just curious. Maybe I'll rephrase the question. Where are you seeing it, both in the Canadian model and any of the other discussions that are happening and have been utilized previously? Who actually has the authority then to one, take possession of it, because as you point out, if you've got the legal right to the interest, you got the legal right to the principal. Who has that, is granted that authority, and then who is granted the authority to distribute that?
So the theory is that the national governments can transfer into any of the Russian state assets in their jurisdiction into escrow accounts for the benefit of the victims as a state countermeasure to Russia's aggression. So the way that would work is under the president's IEPA authority, he could transfer all this, and there are precedents for this. He can transfer this into an escrow account held in the States and then an international escrow account with this limited purpose of compensating the victims of Russian aggression. Then you need to create an international mechanism, which the U.S. would participate in creating, to then manage that distribution, which needs to have a proactive, urgent speed of relevance.
That was what I was afraid of, is where it does, if it just simply takes one participant to bog the whole thing down, guess what? It's not going to work, in my,
Right.
my
and
humble opinion.
Which is, by the way, one reason why, and when they're debating this in the EU, some people say, well, we should have a new EU directive to govern this, but under our common foreign and security policy, but one member, like Hungary, for example, could botch that.
Yeah.
So if you create something perhaps managed by the G7 Donors Coordination Platform, that is a relatively supple instrument in which the United States could play a part. One thing that you've done in the bill you've drafted, Mr. Chairman and Congresswoman Capter, is you're creating mechanisms in which Congress gets insight and some oversight into how the United States participates in that process and what the mechanism does and how the money is spent, which I think is an appropriate role for the Congress. But there are precedents for how to do this, but the design of this international mechanism I'm discussing that's both policy-driven but also has a reactive claim side, but can have some conditionality on reform and the EU accession process, that's a heavy lift. That's building that mechanism. It will be the biggest job since we built the Economic Cooperation Administration to run Marshall Plan aid 70 years ago. That serious work has not yet really begun because we're just working on the preliminary phase of mobilizing and using this money.
And Mr. Chairman, I know the time's expired, but I was glad to see Arthur Vandenberg from Michigan was part of creating the Marshall Plan. But there was a lot of lessons to learn from World War I and how that reconstruction had happened. And I want to make sure that we are not going back to some of those mistakes as to how we have those responsible for this war paying for the damages that were done there. So with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Liu is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman McCall and Ranking Member Meeks, for holding this hearing today, and thank you, witnesses, for being here. I want to first follow up on what Chairman McCall said about the Army Tactical Missile System. In June of this year, Chairman McCall and Congress members Kane and Keating and Golden and Wilson and I introduced a resolution calling for ATACMS to be immediately transferred to Ukraine. I'm pleased that the administration has done so, and as Ms. Heinrichs noted, ATACMS were used to destroy 9 Russian helicopters, which, if correct, would be the worst one-day loss for the Russian Air Force in Russian history. I have questions now about the REPO Act. I am a co-author. I agree with the sentiments of the witnesses today. So my first question is, do you believe the administration, even without this bill, has authority right now to transfer the frozen Russian assets to Ukraine?
Yes, it does. It has it under the existing IEPA authorities that the President has already invoked. And the Renewed Democracy Initiative has put out a really extensive legal brief that goes into great detail about this. And I think actually the administration's lawyers are coming around to the view that, yes, they do have the authority under existing law. What the REPO Act does is, one, it reaffirms that, but two, it makes Congress a partner in this with regulation and oversight that's an appropriate congressional role. So by both reaffirming the authority and getting Congress to join the executive in doing this together, I think it makes it a truly national effort with an appropriate congressional part.
How would you respond to critics who say this would make it harder for other folks in the future to want to invest in the United States?
I think, by the way, you can look at the numbers. After we froze Russian assets, everybody understood the political risks that might be involved with putting their money into dollar holdings. The Chinese called in all their bankers and asked them, do we have any other options? That happened last year. And you can just simply track what's happened in the international financial markets and see how folks have now priced in that political risk. But the result is still a very strong demand and interest in the dollar. But here again, to come back to Congressman Meeks' point, by working with the euro and the yen and sterling, we give them no place to go. If they want to participate in the world economy, then they're just going to have to invest in assets like that.
Go ahead.
Congressman, I will say, agree with what was just said, but the other thing that's very interesting and good in the repo bill that is different is this provision, Section 103, that would prohibit the release of blocked Russian sovereign assets. I think that's an incredibly important element of this bill. So that it removes the temptation possibly for any kind of sweetener for the Russians to have access to these funds and leave Ukraine in a lurch whenever they have to rebuild their society. So that's a very important part of the bill.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Moran is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So let me just tailor off what you just said, Ms. Heinrichs. When you were talking about the best use of these funds, why would it be better to transfer these assets for Ukraine's direct benefit than to use them for leverage and negotiations and ending this conflict at some point?
Congress, it comes back down to the fundamental question at the end, who's going to foot the bill for rebuilding Ukrainian society? Somebody's going to have to do it. It should not be the American people primarily. They're footing a pretty significant bill, I think, that benefits American industry and benefits our own military. But this particular piece should be, should be carried out by the perpetrators of this act. And so I think that it would be a mistake to hold that out as a sweetener to get the Russians to come to the end of the conclusion.
And Mr. Zelikow, you mentioned earlier in response to one of my colleagues' questions that it looks like that under current law, under the IEPA authorities, the president can do this activity now. Do you know why the president's not doing that? And if he chose to do that, could he do it immediately, or is there any delay in that?
They could act immediately. They've delayed a long time, partly, to be very blunt, because I've been talking to a lot of people about this. They had very deep interagency disagreements inside the administration over how to proceed. And they found their bandwidth was totally overwhelmed by other Ukrainian-related concerns, and they didn't give this heavy attention until fairly recently. And now that they have given it sustained attention, I think the president has actually settled at a fundamental level those interagency disputes, and they are now moving forward to try to find a way to make this work. I think the point you raised a minute ago about, gee, do we want to hold this back as leverage, was one factor in the back of the minds of some people. I think as the war has continued on through this year, I think hopes of a quick settlement of the war somehow have dissipated. I think they realize that they're in it for, this is going to be a long war. Everyone that sobering realization has kind of sunk in. And also, from a legal point of view, if you want to, you could credit the Russians in any peace negotiation. You basically say this is a credit against your liability for rebuilding Ukraine.
And I want to come back to Ms. Heinrich just for a follow-up on that before we run out of time. So there's some reservations also with our European partners in undertaking this activity as well. Can you talk a little bit about the reservations and what the U.S. needs to be doing to put pressure on the Europeans to agree to this type of activity?
Well, I think one of the most powerful things the United States can do to convince the European allies to do it is to follow the lead of the Canadians and pass this bill ourselves, and that would demonstrate that we are really serious about it and that we have a strong stake in doing this, and that would encourage others to do the same. The last piece, sir, I think it's also just really important to steward the American taxpayers well, and that gives them confidence that they can continue to support the war effort, and that's the other really important piece of this bill, is it assures the American people.
Thank you both. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Ms. Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for having this roundtable, and thanks to both of the professors for coming today. And there's so much more I'm certain we can learn from you. Hope it's not in a truncated version again, so I'll speak as quickly as possible in thanking you. Mr. Zekalo, you framed it very well. Economic warfare is the center of gravity. You also talked about the process of taking control of Russian assets. Can you talk more about the timing? And I'm thinking of it in a few ways. As a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, we have been to many European nations. To a nation, they say the United States is the indispensable partner here, and they say that with all humility, not blowing smoke. We visited The Hague and sat with lead prosecutor Khan, and everyone is talking about waiting us out, not just waiting out Congress's support, but waiting out the outcome of the next election. They asked us specifically about that. Mr. Putin is clearly waiting for the outcome of the next election in hopes that it will not be re-election of Joe Biden, who has, I'm really proud, and there he is in Israel right now. Timing. How does this work? And how do we make sure, you already said it's going to be into 2025. How do we use this leverage, this economic warfare, as the center of gravity in this conflict to bring the timing tighter to a successful conclusion for Ukraine?
So that's a great question. And this is why action on this issue is so urgent now. Because the operational timeline to stand this up on a massive multi-hundred billion dollar scale is if we move on this in the next couple of months and mobilize the money, we could get an enormous operation up and running with a relatively secure source of funding by next year. If we get that up and running by the middle of next year, we then insulate ourselves to some extent against the kind of electoral risk to which you gently alluded.
Thank you. Did you want to add to that, please?
Sure. I would just say, that one of the things that we can do, I mean, not only does it contribute, provides that backstop, but the other thing I would just encourage is when the president says that we're in it for as long as it takes to continue to make sure that Ukraine is armed sufficiently and has the operational leeway to make it very short. And so to really help Ukraine truly succeed in this counteroffensive on the battlefield, and that's how you're going to actually get to the point where you can convince the Russians that they're not going to be able to wait us out or prevail.
Exactly right. And I have always focused on the expression to give everything Ukraine needs to win, not just everything she needs. What does she need to win? And with that, I will yield back, and I thank you.
General yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Heinrichs, this committee, as you've heard today, on a bipartisan basis, believes that President Biden has consistently been too slow in providing critical weapons capabilities to Ukraine. It is unacceptable that this administration, as Mr. Zelikow mentioned to an earlier response, has not worked faster to use frozen Russian sovereign assets to compensate Ukraine. For both of you in this answer, if the United States did transfer Russian sovereign assets to Ukraine, how could Ukraine best use these in the near term?
In the near term, what they would do, I think, is begin undertaking a comprehensive program to shore up their infrastructure, withstand the coming Russian campaigns to further damage that, and begin to rebuild the basic transportation infrastructure and other things that can then begin to unlock a really bright future for the rest of the Ukrainian economy. There are things that can be done then to move Ukrainian industry into new sectors, because I think the Ukrainian goal is not just to restore what they had 5 years ago, but actually to use this as a way to build back better, to imagine a brighter future in partnership with Europe. And then if the money is managed well, the leverage this gives to encourage the Ukrainian reform process as part of EU accession, then makes Putin's whole effort here is, if I can't conquer Ukraine, I will wreck it and make it ungovernable. And we'll show decisively that that objective cannot be achieved.
Yes, Congressman, I would just say, so many months after the beginning of this war, the Biden administration should take an entirely different approach to steering this thing to a conclusion, and this would be part of this new approach. The Ukrainians, of course, can begin rebuilding their society, but it should attend with it other changes, as I've mentioned now previously many times, not just an increase in weapons flow, but the kinds of weapons and this operational leeway I keep talking about. That can help Ukraine actually succeed and score victory. What this administration has done thus far, it seems, as they thought that they would be able to essentially wait out the Russians once Russia didn't prevail immediately, and that's why it's been slow at every turn, fearing escalation. But that has not happened, and so now is the right time to take on this particular tool.
I think it's the right tool. I think the administration should have acted a lot more quickly on an administrative basis, as well as right? That's acted a lot more quickly on this front line on the economic side, freezing assets, as well as on weapons side. I mean, the long-range ATACMS are necessary. You know, right now they only have the short-range ones, and we need to ensure that we have the longer-range ones as well. And that's what the things that Congressman Liu and I and others have been talking about as well.
If I may, sir, the reason, another principle that has been misunderstood throughout this conflict is this notion of escalation. Escalation is not bad. It's only bad if it's the adversary who's escalating to prevail. We want Ukraine to escalate to win, to convince the Russians to end the war. If you do not permit the Ukrainians to escalate, then you only have a long, protracted war of attrition that none of us can afford.
We have to give them every tool necessary to win in a time-sensitive and time perspective. Thank you.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Ms. Manning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I fully support doing everything necessary to support Ukraine and to make sure that Ukraine wins this war and that Putin and the Russians pay the price of their appalling war of aggression against a sovereign nation. And I support the policy being discussed today, and I thank both of our witnesses for your testimony and for your thoughtful articles on this topic. I want to ask about something that Mr. Meeks referenced in his opening remarks, and I think perhaps Mr. Huizinga referenced in the statement he made a few moments ago, and ask each of you, what do you see as the potential unintended consequences of the policy being discussed today? In what way could this policy come back to haunt us or our allies in the future?
Well, whenever you do a large thing in international affairs, there are going to be unintended consequences from that. And rather than just sort of say, oh, be dismissive about that concern, I'll say if you embark on this, then people will be tempted to try to use these sorts of precedents against us. They'll be limited in their ability to do that because of the fundamental places where money is held in the world economy. A lot of people don't do business with the United States because they love us. They do business with us because they think it's necessary. If they could expropriate our property with no penalty, they would. Venezuela tried that. Most of the world doesn't want to follow Venezuela's example. So yes, there are some potential unintended consequences of people trying to use this or use this precedent. But one reason we've tried to set this under international law is let's use the standards of international law to govern this countermeasure. International law allows these countermeasures, but it says you can only do this if the target country's outlaw behavior is extreme. And there's a standard for that. It turns out Russia totally meets that standard. This is the most extreme case of international aggression since the Second World War, bigger than Korea, bigger than Kuwait. But by setting that kind of standard, it makes that slippery slope a little less slippery.
Thank you. Ms. Heinrichs?
I would just agree with what was just said, and as I sit here, I keep thinking about how not actually moving forward in this way could have the unintended effect of undermining the principles on which international law is meant to defend territorial integrity and the sovereignty of nations. And so I see far more benefit and very concerning, in fact, if we don't actually pursue this path.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Generally yields. Mr. Stanton's recognized. If Mr. Stanton,
I think we're done.
or do you wish to? Okay. Otherwise, we have to get to the floor soon.
Just a very small question. There are some concerns that if we were to transfer these assets, use it for the benefit of the Ukrainian war, there would be an impact on the U.S. dollar. Just get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's why we got in some of the best people we could on international finance, just do the analysis on that. It turns out because the overwhelming, the 93-3, because 93% of the foreign exchange holdings are held in G7 countries and only 3% in renminbi. Running to the renminbi because they're worried about the dollar is something people would do if they wanted to do it already. They've already priced in the political risk of dollar holdings after they've seen what we've done. And you can see their asset allocations now. The dollar is involved in 88% of all foreign commercial transactions on one side of the transaction or another. So it's hard to run away from it, especially if the euro, yen, and sterling are in there with you. There's really kind of no place to go if you want to participate in the international economy. Working with Larry Summers, the former Treasury Secretary, with Bob Zellick, with Brad Setzer, who studies international finance, we ran some numbers about worst case scenarios and so on. And we think that that concern, which sounds good as a soundbite, it turns out on analysis, it fades away.
Ms. Heinrichs, any comment on that, the dollar issue? Sounds like a suggestion is it's better to work with the Eurozone, though, and not the U.S. go it alone on this issue?
Absolutely, and vice versa. So Christine Lagarde at the European Central Bank has said that they've been afraid to move because they don't want the euro exposed, of course, unless they're with the dollar. One of the interesting things here is the U.S. only holds a fraction of the relevant Russian money, because the Russians tried to get their money out of our jurisdiction. But when you go to Europe and ask them what's holding them up, they all say we're waiting for the American lead. So even though we may only hold a fraction of the money, we hold a lot more than a fraction of the relevant clout. And, but we need to go together, exactly as you imply.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
That's a great point to close on. And I want to thank both of you for being here today. Thanks for your help on the bill. I look forward to marking it up out of committee and passing it. And it's been a great service to not only this committee, but to the nation. And I look forward to further discussions with you. Thanks so much.